We have now learned to use constraints into the user interface of our iOS application so it resizes depending on the screen that this is going to be displayed. In this lecture, we're going to add the other view that we will need at the beginning to implement the register functionality. And adding a new view is going to be as easy as going to the toolbox and search for a view controller. Notice that there are many types of view controller. There is a table view controller, a split view controller, a page view controller, but there is one that is just called view controller. This is the one that we have to use. And again, all we have to do is drag it into the designer. Like I've mentioned before, on iOS, all of the interface is going to be defined inside of one single file, the storyboard file. And so, just by dragging this new view controller, we have a new view controller available. And in here I want to define the interface for the register page. And I'm going to start right from the beginning to set some constraints. I will start with one text field. This text field, just like we did with the first view, is also going to be perfectly centered into the screen. And it's going to be as wide as the guidelines allow for. And again, right from the beginning, I'm going to set the necessary constraints for this to be aligned horizontally, vertically, and to be as wide as the guidelines allow. Right above this one, I am going to define two other text fields. And again, these are going to have the constraints that will make these elements have the exact same width and to have some spacing from the top of the previous text field and to the left of the screen. One of these elements is going to be for the email and two of them for passwords, one for the password itself and another one to confirm the password. And all of these have to be the exact same width. That's why I'm making that relationship, establishing that constraint. Have some spacing from one to the other and have the same spacing from the left. And then I am going to drag a button. This button is going to have to be very similar to the button that we have in the sign-in page. So in addition to adding these constraints, so it's as wide as the text fields and has a spacing from the third text field and has some spacing from the left, I also have to change its values, starting with the text color, so it is white, and I am going to change its background to be a custom background. I'm going to try and find a blue that is very similar to the one that I selected earlier. And then I have to change the value for the properties of each and every one of these elements. Starting with the text for the text fields. I don't want them to have any text, but I do want to set a hint, or in this case a placeholder. The first one is going to be email address. For the second one, I'm also going to get rid of the text and I'm going to set a placeholder of password. And for the third one, which is also not going to have any text, I'm going to set a placeholder of confirm password. In the case of the button, I am going to change the title to be register. And now, just like we did with the view for the login page, we have to set names. But notice what happens when I select one of the new elements and try to set a name. For example, email text field. When I click on enter, I get a runtime error detected. And this happens because we don't currently have any class associated with this new view controller. If I select the entire view controller, remember that to select the entire view controller, you have to select it from the bottom bar. You see that there is no class. There is no class setting here. So when we try and set a value for each and every one of these elements, there is no class where to get the value. Because when we set the name for these elements, a new variable is created. Notice the view controller that we have by default. Notice that we can expand it. And inside, there is a viewcontroller.designer.cs C# file. And if you open it, an email text field, a password text field, a register button, and a sign-in button are defined. These are properties of their corresponding types depending on the elements that were defined in the storyboard. And these are created by default without us having to do anything. This is the exact same thing that is trying to happen when we set the value for these elements. but since there is no view controller associated with this view, there is no way of creating those properties. But all we have to do is create the class. And in fact, it's going to be very simple. In the properties for this view controller and in the class option, all we have to do is write the name of that class. For this, I want it to be register view controller. And as soon as I type enter, notice that in the Solution Explorer, that register view controller file has been created. It inherits from the UI view controller, and it has been set as the class for this new view. And now we can set the names for these elements. We can start with the email text field. And if I type enter, now there is no error. And if I open the registers view controller designer file, we now see how this has been successfully created. So that was exactly what we needed for us to not get these errors that we were receiving. I am going to set the same for the password text field and for the confirm password text field. And of course for the register button as well. Now in the case of iOS, it doesn't matter if these elements have the same names that some of its counterparts in the other view controller, because these are going to be defined in two different sources, in two different files. So these are going to be different values. In the case of Android, they were all going to be defined in one single file. That's why we set different names. So that's it. We have created a new view inside of the iOS storyboard file, and we have created a new view controller for that new view that we added. In the next lecture, we're going to implement the navigation between the first view controller that we had and this new view controller.